All right, got cut off in the previous video. Once again, I ran out of my 15-minute time period, so I'm making the second video to finish First Peter chapter 2. In the last video, I was talking about the church teaching on the question of how a Christian should relate to his government. So I'm going to go over this teaching again in summary, and then I'll finish the chapter. All right, so Peter is talking about why and to what extent a Christian needs to be subject to legitimate government authority, right? And he says, first off, you have to be subject to legitimate government authority for the Lord's sake, right? Because all authority, government authority included, comes from God, right? So even if you don't like your government, even if you disagree with what your government is doing, if your government has legitimate authority over you, you do have to be subject to that government to a certain extent. Not for the government's sake, not for your sake, right? But in recognition that this government authority comes from God. So at a very basic level, we have to obey our governments because we live in a civil society. And as Christians, we believe that authority exists in civil society as a gift from God. This does not mean that government is ruling according to God's will. This does not mean that the person who is the king or the queen or the president is in positions of power because God wants them to be there, because God put them there. Oh, these bells at school are so annoying. Instead, they are in these positions of power because people put them there, right? Maybe they put themselves there. But the fact that they have power and that they are exercising authority over a civil society means that in a limited way, we do have to be subject to this government power. All right. The second thing he says is that we have to be subject to government authority to follow the example of Christ, right? So Christ teaches that we have to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but give to God what is God's. He teaches this in the Gospels, right? What does this mean? It essentially means that in a civil society, laws are set up that we are obligated to follow, not because we're Christians, but because we're members of that society, right? But we also have to recognize that everything we have belongs ultimately to God. So if you have to choose between following God and following your government, you follow God, right? You follow the dictates of revelation given to us through the Bible or through the church, right? So the church teaches that the government has to be moral. It has to serve the common good. That means do what's good for its people. And it has to follow its own laws, right? You can't have a government that just like sets up rules about how it's going to work and then totally breaks all of those rules and becomes a dictatorship, right? It's not what government is supposed to do, right? And if government does overstep its bounds, citizens do have the right and should use the right to defend their freedom. Right? So if the government arrests you and throws you in jail for no reason, right, you have the right to defend yourself or to try to prevent that from happening. Or if you are thrown in jail for no reason, you would have the right to try to escape. Right? Government can't just use its power to take away your basic rights, like your freedom or your right to life or your right to your property. You have the right to defend that. However, even if your government is doing bad things or you don't like the people who are in government, maybe you don't like your king or your queen, maybe you don't like your representative in Congress, maybe you don't like your president, right? That does not mean that you don't have to obey the government, right? even if the government is doing really bad stuff, the church says you still have to do things that will help the government serve the common good, right? So even if your government is involved in a war that you think is deeply immoral, right, you still have to pay taxes to that government, right? And it's true, some of that tax money is going to be used to pay for the war you think is immoral. But other funds from your tax money are going to be used to do things like build roads and bridges and help pay for the police and the fire department. Right? So the church generally rejects anarchy. Right? Anarchy is a ideology that says government authority is bad and you don't have to participate in it at all. The church says no. If you're in a civil society, you have to participate in government within reason. All right. So there's all kinds of complicated questions that can arise from that. We're not going to go into that. I just wanted to give you sort of a sense of what Peter is saying. So following the moral law is necessary for a Christian's freedom. And following government laws, as long as these laws are just, meaning they're not immoral, following these laws is also necessary for freedom, even if you disagree with it, right? So a lot of people think the government's way of taxing people is bad, right? Well, you still have to pay the taxes, even if you think the taxes you're paying are too much, right? Because this is necessary to live in a civil society. This is necessary for freedom. You can't just say, you know what, I disagree with the way that the state of California is taxing me right now, so I'm just not going to pay, right? You can't do that. You still have to pay. All right. Last slide for chapter 2. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to the kind and gentle, but also to the overbearing. For one is approved if, mindful of God, he endures pain while suffering unjustly. All right, so Peter directs the end of chapter 2 to slaves or servants. So he was just talking to Christians who are members of civil societies, many of whom who have governments that are corrupt or are abusing their freedom, and he tells them how to act. Now he's going to talk to a very specific group of Christians, servants, many of whom are slaves. All right, so he says, obey your masters, even cruel masters. Now, there's a quick note I need to make about what he means by servants and slavery. Servants and slaves in ancient Judea were very different than slaves, say, in the South in the United States before the Civil War, right? The institution of slavery existed, and it was not good that it existed, but it was not the extreme form of slavery that we saw in the American South, right? Slaves in the ancient world had very limited freedom, but they still had a lot of basic fundamental rights, right? So Peter is not talking here about whether or not slavery is good or bad, but it is important that you know this isn't like African American slavery in the South, where slaves are being abused in all sorts of ways and their rights are completely taken away from them and all of that. All right. So he says, obey your masters, even cruel masters, because God is pleased when we suffer injustices in imitation of Christ. Right? So Christ suffered injustice at the hands of the Jewish leaders, at the hands of mobs who ridiculed him, spit on him, kicked him, tried to stone him. Christ suffered injustices at the hands of the Roman government when he was crucified. Right? And so Peter is saying that if you are in a position where you're a servant or a slave, obey your master not because your master is someone who deserves to be obeyed, but because in doing so, you suffer injustice in imitation of Christ. Right? In fact, you can use your suffering, your example, your willingness to suffer injustice to inspire others to become Christian, to maybe themselves imitate Christ, or at the very least become baptized. Right? So this is very similar to what he says to citizens obeying civil authorities, even when civil authorities are unjust and persecuting people. So remember, governments at this time are not friendly to Christians, right? A lot of Christians at this time are very poor. Many of them are slaves, many of them are servants, and they are working for pagan masters who are abusing them because they are Christian. Peter's saying, I know that you're suffering, but this is an example. This is an opportunity to set an example to bring people into the fold of the church. And then, of course, he uses the example of Christ on the cross, and he says, this is the ultimate example of someone who is suffering unjustly, right? Christ, who is sinless, was crucified by unjust authorities, by people who abused him. So we should look to the example of the suffering Christ on the cross in order to avoid temptations to sin while we are suffering. Peter understands that while people are suffering, sometimes they are tempted to commit sins in order to reduce their suffering or to experience some kind of happiness or pleasure in the midst of suffering. Right? Peter is saying, nope, don't do that. Look to the example of Christ on the cross to allow you to persevere in the face of suffering. And then, of course, you have to live an exemplary life to serve for the conversion of sinners, for the conversion of those who are persecuting you. All right, that's it for chapter 2. Tomorrow, we'll move on to chapter 3. Oh, yeah, I have one direction there. And that is it. I'll see you guys